On the 187th evening since he first found them, Orion Hale followed the same threadbare path into the ashwood expanse with 2 warm canisters, balanced in his pack and a third tucked under his arm. He walked without a headlamp. He knew every root and rut now, which stones would wobble under his heel, and which would answer with the hollow clack of air pockets in the soil. The twin suns were slipping away behind the sawtooth ridgeline, pouring their divided light through the silver leaves until each frond looked coin-thin, and cold enough to cut. The ashwood expanse had always sounded gentler than it was. Trees here grew like braided cables, their trunks plated with iron-gray bark that could throw sparks when struck. Orion had learned that by accident and decided not to repeat the experiment. Vines stitched the canopy into a quilt that filtered wind into a perpetual hush, so birdsong never carried far, and human voices seemed to fall at your feet. The forest swallowed loneliness and threw it back as quiet. He came because he couldn't stand his own quiet anymore. Back at his cabin, he'd left the kettle on the warmer and the console set to sleep. The cabin was 1 room that pretended to be 3, partitioned by shelving made from ammunition crates and old polymer tarps. He had a bed, a workbench for brewing nutrient stew, and a corner where he kept a suitcase he never opened. The walls were carved up by sunlight during the day and by shadows at night, and in the middle of it all hung the painting he'd made of the sky currents on the front lines, a wash of indigo and rust, streaked by vapors where dropships had torn the atmosphere. An old habit, painting. He did it to prove he was still making things instead of only surviving them. The stew clunked softly in the pack with each step. He had started with standard ration blocks thickened with mushroom starch, then added spice combinations he could almost remember from the mess hall: paprika and fenugreek, a little smoke from charroot. Over the months he'd folded in local greens that wouldn't kill anyone, learned which tubers mellowed into sweetness after a second boil, learned to skim the scum without losing patience. Cooking was a discipline like disassembling a pulse rifle, a sequence that rewarded attention. By the time he pushed through the last screen of brush, the sky had gone the kind of green that pretends to be blue until you notice how tired it looks. He stopped at the same ironwood whose roots rose from the ground like ribs. Beneath them, a hollow opened into a wedge-shaped den, part burrow, part storm flap, part altar. He'd found them there 187 nights ago, an accident of poor navigation and stubborn curiosity. He'd come to catalog the ironwood rings for a citizen science project he never submitted to. But the rings could wait when he saw the 2 figures huddled in the root shadow, small and smaller, luminous like plankton under surf. He set the canisters down on the flat rock he'd cleared months back and knelt, palms open. The same ritual, because rituals were the bones of trust. Evening, he said. He didn't know whether the words meant anything to them, but he used them anyway. You spoke to the world you wanted, and sometimes it spoke back. The child saw him first. The glow that lived under its skin at snow, their skin bloomed a shade brighter, running along capillaries like quicksilver shifting toward light. The child made a soft sound that wasn't quite a trill and wasn't quite a purr, and Orion felt his chest slacken. The mother he had started thinking of them that way on the 4th night, and the names stuck. Mother and child lifted her head, eyes like polished ink framed by a corona of downy filaments that rose and fell with her breath. He unclipped the first canister and slid it forward across the stone. The child scooted up on the den's lip, looked to the mother for permission, then accepted the tin with a 2-handed grip. The child's fingers were long and double-jointed, with pads that flashed a faint micro-pattern when they touched metal, like the brief fanning of a cuttlefish. Orion couldn't tell if that was an emotion or a reflex. Perhaps both. The child always ate with gratitude, a joy not blunted by routine. The mother ate last, always last, slow and deliberate and watching. He had once asked himself whether the glow under their skin was useful camouflage, heat regulation, signaling, or merely beautiful. He had stopped asking. Beauty was use enough. He opened the second canister and, at the mother's gesture, placed it within closer reach. She had a way of inclining her head that felt formal but not stiff, acknowledgement rather than submission. The first time she did it, he nearly saluted back out of habit. He had learned to keep his hands relaxed at his sides. The child he had named them Keo in his head. A sound that matched their chirp smelled the stew and made a breathy hum. Orion always waited for that hum before he started talking. It was his permission slip. "Tonight it's the sweet tuber again," he said, as if he were describing a menu, as if he were a host, as if this were ordinary. "With char root, just a little, and the mushroom stock because we're civilized." Kyo took the first bite and did the shoulder wiggle that meant delighted approval. He had once thought the wiggle might be a shiver of cold and brought a second blanket. The blanket became a nest for the cans instead. He poured himself a lid's worth of stew and blew on it. He rarely ate in front of them. Then he learned it mattered that he did, that he trusted his own food. There was a law like that from field medic training. Swallow a pill first. To reassure the panicking patient. Human bodies are liars, but not very good ones. "You can stage your own calm. Storm line moving in," he murmured. "You'll smell it before it hits. Ozone, salt metal. The canopy traps it." And then the mother made a soft, whistling exhale and he stopped. He didn't know if she was asking for quiet or simply relaying something to Kyo in their own language. Sometimes they conversed in sweeps of sound too smooth to be broken into syllables. It reminded him of wind moving through a long tunnel, picking up harmonics along the way. They had not harmed him. In the first week, he had prepared for harm and taken precautions so elaborate they embarrassed him now. The ballistic vest under his jacket, the splinting rod disguised as a walking stick, the microflares in his boot heels. He stopped carrying all of it, one piece at a time, until one evening he realized the only defense left on his person was a spoon. Trust accreted. Sedimentary. You didn't notice it solidify until your weight shifted and held. On the 12th night, he had tried to bring a translation chip, the cheap kind that piggybacked on common phonemes and tabooed words you could guess at. In almost any language, no, yes, food, danger, stop. The mother tapped the device with a single fingertip, hard enough to produce that small, wet spark, and held his gaze until he slid it back into his pocket. He hadn't offered it again. If she wanted their words to be understood, she would offer them. She offered other things. On the 21st night, Kyo toddled out of the den with something they wanted to show him, a ragged sheet of bark etched, with careful grooves. He thought it was a picture until he turned it toward dusk light, and saw that the grooves pierced the bark, not lines but apertures. Lifted, they made a whistle when the breeze crossed them, a sequence of notes rising and sagging as steady as breath, music. The mother watched his face as he listened, and the way her shoulders eased when he closed his eyes in genuine surprise told him his reaction had mattered. He had taught them little tricks in return. The best way to crack the string beans that grew like a fringe on the creek edges, how to set a fish basket and retrieve it without scaring the spawn, how to mark a path with stones so that a person would know it was safe but an animal would not care. He thought these things were small, embarrassments of hospitality, but their lives wrapped themselves around such smallness. Once, Kyo pressed their palm flat against his wrist and held it there, sensing the bright pulse of their capillaries with the thrum at his ulnar artery. Children did that, tested the giveness of other bodies, and Kyo, despite any other differences, was partly a child in the universal way, curious, delighted by rhythm, bored by speeches. Orion let them count beats until his hand tingled. The mother, he would not know her name for many more nights, watched everything, memorized and measured. Her attention wasn't cold. He recognized it as the general's attention at the edge of a contested hill. How much ground? How much supply? How much tomorrow? She had taken stock of him, the way people take stock of a tool they hope to trust. He did not resent that. He would have done the same. He imagined sometimes what had undone them before they came to the Ashwood expanse. A wrecked craft, an argument with a different, less patient human, an illness they could not risk showing to a clinic. There were rumors in town, of course, bright shapes seen skimming the wetlands at dawn, hissing echoes at the quarry, smells of hot metal and wildflower syrup that lingered on roadsides after midnight. The public boards bristled with warnings and jokes, and the jokes were always hung with hooks. The coalition called for containment of off-worlders, and containment always meant cages if you were lucky, something worse if you weren't. He avoided the boards. He had learned that staying informed often meant staying angry, and he could not spare anger these days. On the 43rd night, rain moved through in a single dark sentence and left everything shining. He arrived soaked to the knees to find the den rimmed in fallen feathers. He thought predator, thought blood, thought loss. Keo barreled out laughing. The sound was less a laugh than a series of broken flute notes, and proceeded to show him how the filaments along their arms could detach in a molt. He stood there, rain dripping off his nose, and laughed too. After that, he often found small gifts on the stone when he arrived, a feather like a blade, a loop of root polished smooth by their hands, a snail shell ringed in periwinkle. He never took the gifts without leaving something in return: twine, a bead of fused sand, a drawing of his cabin in 3 swift lines. The exchange became its own grammar. On the 78th night, he stoked a tiny fire in a pit he'd dug and lined with river stones. Fire had frightened them at first. He could tell by the way the mother had gathered Keo close and flattened her filaments against her body like a cat fixing its silhouette. He had started with ember and smoke without flame, feeding the pit with dry moss that made no wind and no heat spike visible from above. Over weeks, they came to tolerate it. Keo discovered the joy of hearing dry twig pop. The mother used a stick like a stylus to draw patterns in ash. He watched her draw a circle, then 3, nested one inside the other, and thought, family, or moon, or both. In town, Orion moved like a ghost. Groceries, filters for the water unit, the occasional liquor ration he only sometimes drank. He kept his head down when someone from the Xenobiological Enforcement Division XED showed their uniform sleeve in the cafe, surprisingly crisp despite the dust. He had learned the scripts of safe conversation with neighbors. You talked about weather and shipments and the intractable stubbornness of engines. You didn't talk about luminous children in tree hollows or the way their mother's silence could recolor the whole day. His past shadowed him differently in the forest. The war lived there as a set of competencies rather than a swallowed scream. He could read tracks. He could listen for machines. He had stopped walking like a man waiting to be targeted. Even his memory of his ex-wife Mara with her wrists inked in tiny birds. Mara who could never sleep with the window closed. Mara who once told him that home should be a place, not a penance, felt like a story the forest kept without sarcasm. Nights were not identical. Some nights, Keo was too tired to finish the stew and curled up with one hand still bent around the canister, the glow dim as a coal under ash. Some nights, the mother disappeared deeper into the den for long minutes, returning with her filaments damp and her breathing slow, as if she had been in a colder room that existed behind the roots. Orion did not ask. He was learning that there were doors in the world that only opened toward you once. He named them in his head on the 89th night. The mother became Lyra because of the way she drew circles in ash like constellations, because her voice when she made low tones vibrated in his ribs, the way certain notes do in old instruments. The child's chirps had become Keo weeks earlier. Saying it felt like aligning a lens. He'd said the names out loud only when he was alone, testing whether they changed how the air lay against his teeth. It felt like a secret he was keeping with himself, which is to say it felt lonely but necessary. On the 100th night, he brought a blanket thick enough to be a wall and hung it from the ironwood roots to make a windbreak. Lyra had watched him hammer in the stakes with the back of his knife and then watched him step away and sit down, palms up, offering, not imposition. Only when she gestured did he creep forward and help her fasten the corners with clever knots he had learned in survival training and promptly forgotten until his hands remembered for him. It snowed once in the Ashwood snow in the loosed sense, silicate dust falling in slow curtains that turned your eyelashes into tiny saws. He came anyway, face wrapped, stew hot, stepping where his old prints had petrified into brittle cups. Lyra leaned forward after Keo swallowed the last spoonful and touched his sleeve between thumb and forefinger. It lasted the length of a blink and meant as much to him as a confession. By then, Orion had built more than one pretext for staying longer each night. A bin to hold empty cans, a cache of dry kindling for damp evenings, a second stone, flat and polished by his hand, for sitting. He told himself these were practicalities. The forest knew better. It had watched him move from courier to companion without filing any paperwork. He learned the forest's danger language by proximity. The sharp insectal buzz that meant a swarm of ash mites had been stirred nearby. You shut your mouth and lowered your head. The sudden silence of capsule birds when a predator glided over the canopy. You stood very still and thought small. The high, metallic whine almost like feedback when the wind shifted and carried sound from the ships on the far highway. You counted until your breath slowed and the whine became a suggestion rather than a blade. That night, the 187th, he heard a different sound while he was rinsing the canisters in the creek after dinner. A chiffon texture in the air, a rise and fall too regular to be the tremble of leaves. He stilled his hands and watched the water flatten. The twin moons had shouldered up into the tree line, casting a chalky light that made depth hard to read. The sound faded. Behind him, Keo peered over the lip of the den, bottom lip glistening with a last smear of stew. Eyes wide, Lyra was statue still, filaments flattened out. Orion let out the breath he hadn't meant to hold. Probably nothing, he whispered, and his voice didn't crack on the lie. He returned to the stone and set the clean canisters upside down, so they would dry without collecting ash. Lyra's eyes tracked his hands. He realized, as he met that gaze, that whatever the sound had been did not begin with tonight and would not end with it. The world was not a circle, but a spiral. You returned to the same places, higher or lower, changed. He had thought, when he first started bringing food, that he was paying a debt he couldn't name. He entertained, between the extremes of fear and pity, the notion that he was performing a private ritual of atonement for the war, or for his infidelities to the future he had once promised Mara and failed to deliver. Standing there, watching the mother and child settle against the root shadow, he understood that debt, penance, and ritual were all too tidy. He came because it made a day worth counting. He came because there was a small, measurable change in the world when he did. Before he left, as always, he placed the third canister farther inside the den for later. He had learned the cadence of their hunger. Keo reached for it, then stopped at Lyra's soft click. Permission delayed, but not denied. He backed away 3 steps, then turned and slipped through the brush, feeling the forest close around him, stealing his heat and keeping his scent. The path widened, then narrowed. He thought of the chiffon sound and filed it under tomorrow. The quiet held until he reached the edge of the expanse, where sky opened into a ragged rectangle above the switchback road. There, on the horizon, very small and very far, a light glided and paused and glided again. Drones moved like that when they were scouting, not chasing. He watched until the light merged with the steady, indifferent stars. When he walked the last mile to his cabin, the smell of still clung to his jacket. He hung it by the door and stood in his stocking feet while the kettle made its thin, burbling song. In the window, the forest looked like a single black muscle curling around the town. He could feel like phantom pressure against his palms, the exact weight of Lyra's brief touch on his sleeve, the warmth where Keo's pulse had aligned with his own. He poured tea he wouldn't drink and set it on the table he didn't use. Then he took down a map and drew a thin line from his cabin to the ironwood and back again, tracing the path as if it were arterial. He folded the map on that crease until the paper remembered it. When he slept, finally, he dreamed of 3 circles nested together, ash pale and perfect, and woke just before dawn with the taste of iron on his tongue and the certainty oddly comforting that the chiffon sound would return. The forest smelled different after rain, like cooled iron and split stone, with an undercurrent of something sweet, as if the trees had exhaled in relief. Orion Hale paused beneath the sloping boughs of an ashwood and inhaled deeply. The air was heavy with storm residue, but that wasn't why he stopped. Something had changed. He had walked this path so many times now that he could have traced every bend blindfolded. Yet tonight, a prickle danced on the back of his neck. It wasn't danger, not the sharp, cold adrenaline spike that had kept him alive through to campaigns, but something subtler. Anticipation, perhaps, curiosity, a weight in the air that wasn't weather. It had been weeks since that strange chiffon sound in the canopy. He hadn't heard it again, but the memory of Lyra's stillness, how her whole body had gone alert, filaments rigid as glass threads refused to leave his mind. Since then, she had been different, more watchful, more distant, scanning the horizon at the slightest noise. Kyo, too, had grown quieter. The child still trilled and hummed, still greeted Orion with wide eyes and luminous smiles. But now those smiles seemed distracted, like they were listening for something beyond his hearing. And then there was the other change. Lyra had started following him, not far. Not enough to reveal herself to any town patrols or passersby. But every night when Orion left the den, he felt her presence a few dozen paces behind, ghosting through the trees. At first he thought he was imagining it, the way one imagines footsteps in the dark when the heart is restless. But on the third night, he'd turned suddenly and seen a sliver of her form vanish behind an ironwood. She hadn't tried to hide it since it was a test. He knew that. The question wasn't whether he was dangerous, they already trusted him more than most humans, but whether they were, whether the world beyond their hollow could be trusted at all. The unspoken language. When he arrived that evening, Kyo was already waiting outside the den, perched on a moss-covered root like a fledgling bird. The child's glow pulsed softly, matching the rhythm of their breath. Orion smiled. "Hungry, huh?" he said, lowering the canisters. Kyo chirped in response, a higher, sharper sound than usual. Orion frowned. He had learned to read their sounds over the months. This wasn't excitement. It was urgency. Lyra emerged from the hollow a moment later, moving with deliberate grace. Even after half a year, Orion still marveled at how she walked, not quite gliding, not quite stepping, but shifting her weight with a precision that made no sound at all. Her filaments were dim tonight, and her expression was different, less guarded, but not softer either. There was purpose in her gaze. She pointed toward the canopy, and then made a twisting motion with her hand. Orion had no idea what the gesture meant, but he'd learned enough not to ignore it. "What is it?" he asked. "Something coming?" Her eyes flicked to the sky again, then back to him. Finally, she did something she had never done before. She beckoned him into the den. The hollow Belowarian hesitated. Until now, the hollow had been there's a sacred boundary he never crossed. He had always left the food at the threshold and stepped back, never intruding on their space. But tonight, Lyra was inviting him in. It was an unspoken statement of trust and something else too, necessity. He ducked under the root arch and followed her inside. The interior was larger than he'd imagined. The roots formed a natural chamber, reinforced with resinous material that glowed faintly in the dark. Strange glyphs etched in spirals and lines covered the inner bark. They looked mathematical, almost like star charts, but some of them pulsed faintly, as if alive. Kyo scampered ahead, tugging at Orion's sleeve to guide him deeper. The chamber narrowed into a small alcove, and there nestled in a cradle of woven fibers lay a smooth, metallic sphere no larger than a melon. It pulsed gently with the same light as Kyo's skin. "What is this?" Orion whispered. Lyra touched the sphere with both hands. A hum filled the air, so low it vibrated in his chest. Then, in halting but deliberate standard, she spoke. "Heart, ship's heart." Orion blinked. "You mean this is from your vessel?" She nodded once. "Broke, fell, fall." Pieces fell into place. They hadn't landed here intentionally. They were survivors of a crash. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his. "We hide, they hunt." Orion's pulse quickened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was different. "Who's hunting you? The Coalition?" "No." She shook her head, searching for the right words. "Hunters, warfinders, take everything." Her gaze drifted to Kyo. "We run." The words were simple, but the weight behind them wasn't. They weren't criminals. They were refugees. Stories in light for hours. Orion listened. Lyra showed him more than she spoke, weaving images in the air with the light from her filaments. They weren't quite holograms, more like phosphorescent sketches, but they were astonishingly vivid. He saw a planet of violet oceans and spired cities swallowed by flame. He saw fleets enormous, jagged vessels burning through the sky like living knives. And he saw others like her and Kyo, scattered across the stars, fleeing into the dark. "Your people." Orion began carefully. "Are they coming here?" Lyra hesitated. "Maybe, some lost, some far. I do not know." Kyo pressed their hands together, creating a small, delicate projection of a family, 3 tall figures and 1 small one, holding hands beneath twin suns. Then Kyo's light dimmed, and the image broke apart. They died. Orion asked gently. Lyra didn't answer. She didn't need to. The chamber fell silent. The weight of their stories settled into Orion's bones, heavy and cold. He understood now why they stayed hidden, why they didn't trust the coalition, why they didn't try to leave. They had already lost everything once. They weren't willing to risk losing the last of it again. Signs in the sky that night. Orion lingered longer than usual. They shared stew in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When the moons rose high, Lyra stood and walked with him to the edge of the clearing, something she had never done before. "Storm?" he asked. "Not storm." She pointed upward. At first, Orion saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he noticed faint glimmers moving across the sky. Not stars, not meteors. They were too precise, too steady. "Drones," he muttered. Lyra nodded. "Search." Cold dread prickled his skin. The coalition patrolled this region, yes, but not often. And not with that formation. Whoever those drones belonged to, they were looking for something. Maybe for her. Maybe for both of them now. "Listen to me," Orion said, turning to her. "If they find this place, they won't ask questions. They'll just take you. Maybe kill you. We have to do something." Lyra's expression didn't change, but her filaments trembled. "We know." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, and placed a hand on his chest. "You help." The question was simple. The implications weren't. He had promised himself, after the war, that he would never pick a side again. He had seen too many innocents die for causes they didn't understand. But as he looked at Lyra and Kyo, two souls clinging to the last thread of survival, he knew neutrality was no longer an option. "Yes," he said, the word leaving his mouth before he could think. "I'll help." The promise. Sihan. He returned to his cabin that night. Orion couldn't sleep. He sat at his table long after the lights had dimmed, staring at a blank screen as rain tapped against the window. They were hiding from something worse than the coalition, something ruthless and relentless. And now, by helping them, he had painted a target on his own back too. But he didn't regret it. For the first time in years, he felt like his choices mattered. As dawn crept over the horizon, he opened a secure channel on his terminal and typed a message to an old contact, an ex-smuggler named Callan who owed him a favor from the war. It was a dangerous idea, one that could cost him everything. But if Lyra and Kyo were to survive, they needed more than stew and hiding places. They needed a way out. Orion Hale had seen blood moons before on distant colonies, over battlefields and burnt cities, but this one was different. It was enormous, impossibly close, staining the ashwood canopy in shades of rust and ember. The forest seemed to hold its breath beneath that eerie light, as if every living thing knew the night would not end the way it began. Tonight, everything would change, a plan in motion for days. Orion had been preparing. After his conversation with Lyra, he'd contacted Callan, the smuggler he once dragged out of a coalition ambush in the Typhon Belt. Callan owed him more than a favor. He owed him his life, and after some terse messages, Callan agreed to arrange passage on a freighter leaving orbit in a week's time. It was a dangerous route, illegal, unsanctioned, but it would get Lyra and Kyo beyond coalition reach. "You sure about this, Hale?" Callan's message blinked on his terminal. "They catch me, I disappear. They catch you, you disappear twice." "I'm sure," Orion typed back. "They're not safe here." Callan replied with nothing but coordinates and a single word: "Soon." Orion knew he couldn't wait that long. Coalition patrols had doubled in the last 2 days. He'd seen gunmetal drones hovering low over the canopy, their sensor rays spinning like predatory eyes. Someone was searching the ashwood and they were closing in. So tonight, he would tell Lyra the truth. He would tell her about the freighter, about the plan, about the future beyond the reach of those who hunted her. But first, he had to convince her to leave. The off-Earth clearing was bathed in crimson light when Orion arrived. The forest felt alive in a way it never had before, every sound sharp, every shadow restless. He could feel it in his bones. The air itself was expectant. Kyo was waiting for him, perched atop the ironwood roots, their luminous skin reflecting the blood moon's glow. When they saw him, they chirped softly and leapt into his arms. Orion laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from his own mouth in years, and swung them gently before setting them down. Lyra stepped out of the hollow a moment later. She looked different tonight, taller somehow, heavier, as if gravity itself had grown strong around her. The faint shimmer in her filaments pulsed with a strange rhythm, slow and deliberate. She knew something was coming too. "We need to talk," Orion said softly. Lyra tilted her head. "Talk," he nodded, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I found a way out. A friend he can get you off this planet. Both of you. No more hiding. No more running." Lyra's expression didn't change, but the pulse of light beneath her skin shifted faster now, sharper. "Leave?" she repeated. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "Tomorrow night, before dawn. If we go now, you can be on a ship by sunrise. Safe?" She stared at him for a long time, searching his face for something, truth, perhaps, or doubt. Finally, she turned and walked a few paces away, looking up at the blood moon. "Can't," she murmured. The word hit him like a blow. "What do you mean, can't?" She turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd met her, her eyes were filled with something close to fear. "We do not leave. We wait." "For what?" he demanded. "For them to find you? For the coalition to drag you away in chains?" She shook her head, struggling for words. "Not coalition. Not hunters. Them." Orion's heart skipped. "Your people." "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Our people come. Here." The revelation pointed upward, toward the red sky. Orion followed her gaze and saw it. At first, it looked like a star. Then it moved. Then it split into three. The objects were massive, far larger than any patrol craft. Their hulls shimmered faintly against the blood moon's light, etched with symbols that glowed like fire through smoke. As they descended, the air itself seemed to vibrate, a deep resonance that made Orion's teeth ache. He stumbled back. That's a fleet." Lyra nodded. "Not war. Refuge." It didn't make sense. "You mean they're colonizing this world?" "No." She struggled for the words. "Our world. Gone. Burned. We find home. A place to live. To grow." Orion's mouth went dry. He thought of the glyphs etched into the hollow walls, of the stories she had told him, of cities devoured, fleets scattered, families torn apart. They weren't soldiers or invaders. They were survivors, and they were coming here. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyra's eyes softened. "All that remain." Tides of Firth blood moon bathed the clearing in scarlet as the ships drew closer, growing larger and larger until they filled the horizon. Orion's thoughts churned. If the coalition discovered what was happening, they wouldn't hesitate. They'd scramble fleets, launch missiles, sterilize the landing zones. They'd wipe Lyra's people out before they could set foot on the ground. And if they didn't, if the refugees landed, there would be panic, riots, war. He looked at Lyra and Kyo, two faces that had become the center of his world, and his chest ached. He didn't want them to leave. He didn't want this to end. The thought of returning to his cabin, to the empty bed and the quiet walls and the endless silence, was unbearable. "Stay," he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Stay with me." Lyra blinked. "Stay." "Yes." His voice trembled. "Don't go with them. Don't disappear. Stay here. With me for a long time." She said nothing. Then she stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. "If we stay," she said slowly, "your world must change. It must become ours too." Orion's breath caught. He understood. This wasn't a choice about two lives, it was about two worlds. Staying meant more than companionship. It meant commitment, sacrifice. It meant standing against everything his own species might do to stop them. And yet, in that moment, he knew his answer. "I'll fight for it," he whispered. "For you, for them, for us." Lyra's eyes shimmered like starlight. Kyo pressed their tiny hand into his, their glow merging with the warmth of his skin. And above them, the sky burned with the fire of descending ships. The shadow over Ashwood, but the night was not over. As the first of the refugee vessels broke through the clouds, a new light appeared on the horizon, cold, sterile, and unmistakable. A coalition frigate, its hull black as obsidian, slid into orbit. Its signal lights blinked like a predator's gaze. Orion's heart froze. They knew. Lyra turned toward the sky, her filaments quivering. "They come." "Yes," Orion breathed. "And they'll kill us all if they get here first." The forest around them seemed to darken, the red moon bleeding into the earth itself. Somewhere in the distance, engines roared. Orion tightened his grip on Keo's hand and looked at Lyra. Then we'd better make sure they don't. The war he had sworn never to fight again was coming to his doorstep, and this time, he wouldn't run from it. Ashwood Expanse was alive with motion wind whipping through the trees, animals fleeing deeper into the underbrush, the distant thunder of ships breaching atmosphere. Orion Hale stood at the edge of the clearing, breath misting in the cool air, and felt a weight settle over him heavier than any rifle he had carried into battle. The war he had run from had finally caught up, but this time, it wasn't humanity's war alone. It was theirs too, his and Lyra's, Keo's, everyone's. The gathering Storm Coalition patrol drones crisscrossed the sky, their sensor beams cutting through the forest canopy like searchlights. Above them, the vast alien refugee ships hung in low orbit, their silhouettes blotting out the morning stars. The refugees hadn't landed yet. They were waiting, watching, scanning the planet for signs of hostility. They would find plenty. From his cabin's uplink, Orion had intercepted transmissions, scrambled orders, panicked calls, the grinding bureaucratic machinery of a civilization preparing for confrontation. The Coalition's stance was clear: no unknown vessels would land without permission. And permission, Orion knew, would never be granted. A containment task force had already been mobilized. Dropships were inbound. If Lyra's people landed before those ships arrived, there would be a massacre. If they waited too long, they'd die in orbit. And in the middle of it all stood 3 lives in a clearing beneath an ironwood tree: an old soldier, a mother, and a child. Between 2 worlds, Lyra stood with her hand pressed to the den's resin wall, eyes closed, filaments pulsing in a slow, mournful rhythm. She was communicating. Orion had learned enough to recognize the signs. Somewhere above them, her people were listening. Keo sat nearby, playing with a small cluster of moss and pebbles. Every now and then, they glanced at Orion with wide, trusting eyes. That trust hurt more than any wound he'd taken in battle. "They're scared," Orion said quietly, crouching beside Lyra. "Yes," she whispered. "They fear you. Fear war. Fear. Mistake. They're not wrong." Lyra opened her eyes and looked at him. "And you? Do you fear?" Orion laughed softly. "Always. But fear's just another thing you live through." She studied his face for a long moment. Then, with a motion that felt almost ceremonial, she reached out and took his hand. Her skin was warm, alive with faint pulses of light that synced with his heartbeat. "Then live through this with us." It wasn't a request. It was an invitation, a promise that the planned dropships would be here in less than an hour. Orion knew what they would do. Standard protocol: land a containment perimeter, deploy ground troops, capture or destroy any non-human presence. They'd likely burn the Ashwood if they suspected an alien colony was forming. But Orion knew something else to how those soldiers thought. He had been one of them, and if he could use that knowledge, maybe, just maybe, he could buy Lyra's people enough time to land safely. "I have an idea," he said. "It's insane. It's dangerous. But it might work." Lyra tilted her head. "Tell me." Orion laid it out. They'd moved deeper into the forest, into the ravine network near the old mining tunnels. It was too dense for dropships to land, too risky for heavy armor. He'd trigger a false signal, an electromagnetic pulse that mimicked a crashed pod far from the true location. With luck, the task force would focus on that while the refugees landed in peace. "You'll need to lead your people down once they enter the atmosphere," he said. "Guide them to the ravine. I'll hold off whoever comes looking." Lyra stared at him, her filaments trembling. "You would fight them?" "Yes, your own people." He hesitated. Then, softly, "Not my people." "Not anymore." Something shifted in her expression, then something deep and quiet, a trust beyond words. "Then we stand together," she said. The hour before Daunthe moved quickly. Lyra and Keo gathered the heart from the den, sealing it in a sling of woven fibers. Orion rigged the pulse beacon from scavenged comm parts and buried it beneath a pile of rocks, 1/2 kilometer east. He worked with the precision of a man who had done this 100 times before, because he had. As they prepared to leave, Orion paused and looked back at the den one last time. It was strange how much it meant to him now. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a memory, a beginning. Keo tugged on his sleeve. Go, the child said softly, one of the few words they had learned in his language. He smiled and nodded. Yeah, let's go. The blood sky burst. First coalition dropships tore through the clouds just as the refugee fleet began its descent. The sky was a chaotic ballet of light and fire engines flaring, contrails spiraling, the thunderous roar of atmosphere breaking beneath metal. Orion's pulse quickened. The race had begun. The false signal did its job. As the dropships approached the beacon, they split formation, half diverting toward the decoy site. It wasn't much, but it bought them minutes, precious minutes that could mean the difference between peace and slaughter. Orion led Lyra and Keo into the ravine, weaving through the dense underbrush and shattered stone. The sound of engines echoed above them, followed by the distant crackle of energy discharges. The battle hadn't started yet, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Then the ground shook. A massive shadow passed overhead, one of the refugee ships, descending low. It was larger than any human vessel Orion had ever seen, its hull etched with ancient patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was beautiful, terrifying, alive. They come, Lyra whispered. Then let's make sure they have somewhere to land. The Choicity reached the ravine's heart just as the first coalition troops touched down at the false site. Orion listened to the radio chatter on his earpiece. Confusion, frustration, tactical missteps. It was working, for now, but then a second voice cut through the noise, one he hadn't expected. Orion Hale, former 8th Recon, you are ordered to stand down and surrender. Harboring alien fugitives is a capital offense. He froze. The voice was familiar. Colonel Anders, his former commanding officer. Don't do this, Anders continued. We can talk. You're a hero, Orion. You don't have to throw it all away for them. Orion looked at Lyra, at Keo clinging to her side, at the ships descending like falling stars. I already did, he whispered. He switched off the receiver. Stay forever. The ground trembled as the first refugee ship touched down in the ravine, its landing struts crushing stone to dust. Hatches opened and figures began to emerge, dozens, then hundreds of them. Tall, luminous beings with skin like molten crystal, carrying nothing but their children and what little they had left. Their eyes were filled not with conquest, but with hope. Lyra stepped forward, her filaments blazing with brilliant light. Others responded in kind, their bodies pulsing in a synchronized rhythm, a language of homecoming. Keo let out a joyous trill and ran toward the newcomers, disappearing into a sea of light. Orion stood back, watching them embrace, watching a people who had lost everything begin again. And for the first time since the war, he felt something stir inside him. Not duty, not guilt, belonging. Lyra returned to his side, her expression unreadable. We stay, she said simply. He took a deep breath. Then I stay too, forever. He smiled. Forever. Epilogue. The Bridgeth coalition never managed to contain the landing. The refugees established a settlement deep within the Ashwood expanse, hidden from orbital sensors and fortified by natural terrain. The first contact was tense armed patrols, diplomatic standoffs, but the world did not end. It changed. Orion became the bridge between two civilizations. He taught Lyra's people how to navigate human laws, how to trade, how to speak, and they, in turn, taught him how to see the universe not as a battlefield, but as a shared home. Years later, when the twin suns dipped behind the silver leaf canopy, he still walked the same path into the forest, sometimes with Keo at his side, sometimes alone. And every time, he passed beneath the roots of the ironwood tree and touched the place where it had all begun. The war-scarred soldier who once carried Stu into the woods had found more than gratitude. He had found purpose, family, a future. And every night, as stars bloomed across the sky, he whispered the same words into the stillness. Stay, stay forever.